Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 16 in our response and refutation to Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man. We come now to the section on pages 47 and following. 47 and following. 48 specifically and following, in which Mr. Frost makes some truly amazing, truly unprecedented, amazing claims. And just as with his claims in regard to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, which we examined in our last video, I must confess to you that the very first time I read his comments on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 and following, I was stunned. I knew that I had never read, in all of my years of reading, research, etc., and that includes Dead Sea Scrolls writings, that includes the Pseudepigrapha, that includes all of the New Testament, obviously. It includes a plethora of commentators. As I mentioned to you, my office here is nothing basically but bookshelves with commentaries and resources. Right here to my left is a shelf with nothing but translations. On my computer is access to almost 60 translations. I knew that I had never read in any of those sources anything that even closely resembled what Mr. Frost claims on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1 and following. Now, Mr. Frost tells us that what he is presenting is his, quote, theory, unquote. And he seems to be somewhat unsure about it because he said whether or not his theory is true, it doesn't change the fact, as he states, that I will offer my own theory, as it were, but will also continue to make the point that regardless of this, regardless of what he says in regard to his theory, for Paul, the parousia is something that now is in heaven before the Father's right hand. Secondly, that whatever the matter may be here, it is entirely in accord with what Paul has written elsewhere. Well, I agree with the latter part of that. I mean, I certainly would agree that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 has to agree with all of Paul's other writings. But when Mr. Frost says that the foundation, and you really have to catch the power of this, the foundation of what he has to say in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is based upon his claim that the parousia of Christ is taken from Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14, that at the ascension of Christ, he ascended to the Father. That's his parousia, according to Mr. Frost. That's his parousia, to the right hand of the Father. That parousia, that presence, is now hidden, but it's real. And it is the day of the Lord. It is the day of salvation. And you really, really must catch the power of what he says on page 50. It is my contention, and he says with the support of some, that Paul is not countering a false epistle, but is telling them not to be disturbed by their letters concerning the parousia as it is now. The day of the Lord has come. The verb has come is an estame in the perfect tense, has arrived and is now. This is certainly Paul's own view. For he says, in a favorable time, I will listen to you. In a day of salvation, I have helped you. Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. So make no mistake. Please catch the power of this. It is Mr. Frost's contention that the day of the Lord had already arrived. Now, with that in view, what I challenge you, the viewer, to do is go to BibleGateway.com, look up 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. Just look up verse 1 first of all. There's a little tab there that allows you to click on all English translations. You will find there are 56 English translations of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1, of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 for that matter. And you will find that every single one of those translations, and by the way, you can add to that the literal concordant translation, which is not yet there, but you will not find a single English translation that supports Mr. Frost's, quote, theory, unquote. And let me add, Mr. Frost's own translation refutes his own theory. Here is Mr. Frost's own translation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 and 2. Now, brothers, we urge you concerning of the parousia of our Lord Jesus Christ and of our gathering around him, do not be so quick to be disturbed about it in your mind. Now watch this, pay particular attention. Nor your spirit troubled, neither by our word, nor our letter, that says the day of the Lord is present. Unquote. Wait a minute. Mr. Frost's own translation says, don't be deceived by a word as if it's from us, or by an epistle as if it was from us, i.e. Paul, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Do not believe it. In other words, Mr. Frost's own translation says that Paul is saying to the Thessalonians, do not believe anything that says the day of the Lord has come. But then Mr. Frost tells us, the day of the Lord has come. The verb has come is an estime in the perfect tense, has arrived and is now. This is certainly Paul's own view, unquote. So on the one hand, Mr. Frost translates the text somewhat accurately, but his own translation says, do not allow anyone by any means, whether by a word or by a letter, to the effect that says the day of the Lord has come. Don't believe that. But Mr. Frost tells us, hey, the day of the Lord has come. And he says that's what Paul actually taught. So here we ostensibly have Mr. Frost claiming that Paul on the one hand said, don't let anyone deceive you that the day of the Lord's already come. Don't let them deceive you into believing that the day of the Lord has already come. Oh, but wait. Paul supposedly taught the day of the Lord has already come. Now, folks, I'm sorry. That is a blatant and fatal contradiction. Now, Mr. Frost goes ahead to say that it appears that Paul has caught wind of an error that has crept into their thinking. Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, saying, now pay really attention to the sleight of hand here that Mr. Frost engages in. This is some true verbal sleight of hand. And if you don't catch the power of it, you will not catch how bad it truly is. Okay, once again, page 50. It appears that Paul has caught wind of an error that has crept into their thinking. Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, saying, the apostasy and the revelation of the man of sin, the son of perdition, should come first. The one who opposes and raises himself above all that is called God or worship, so that he would sit in the temple of God, etc., etc. Now, Mr. Frost continues. The idea of a man of sin or lawlessness would arise and blaspheme God and take his place in the temple was a current idea among some Jewish circles, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The wicked one would come first and exalt himself, causing all sorts of havoc, and then the Son of Man would bring about his day, ushering in the restoration of all things, replacing the wicked one in the temple. It is possible to see that Paul entirely dismisses such an idea and counters it with his understanding. Well, very kindly here, with all due respect, no, it is not possible to understand that way of thinking. Look at what the text actually says. And again, I hope that you will take the time, that you will actually go to BibleGateway.com. Now, watch this. I'm going to begin reading with verse 2 for time consideration. Paul urges them not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. But remember, Sam Frost says the day of Christ has come. And yet he tells the Thessalonians, don't be deceived into believing the day of the Lord has come. You just got to catch that. Now watch. Let no one deceive you by any means. That day will not come unless. Now, you will notice that the words for that day will not come are in italics. It is to be granted, it is to be noted. That means that those specific words, that day will not come, are not in the original. But as Leon Morris and a host of other Greek translators take note, that's demanded by the syntax. It's demanded by the grammar. It's demanded by the context. So those words are there because they are literally demanded. Okay? So Paul says, do not allow anyone to deceive you into believing the day of the Lord has come, because that will not come. Now watch this. Unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Now, Mr. Frost would have you believe that the idea that the apostasy and the man of sin had to come before the day of the Lord was a false doctrine. Well, point number one, no, that it was not a false doctrine unless the entire history, of the Jewish eschatological narrative was wrong. Emil Schurer, in his 5-volume tomes, points out that was standard Jewish belief. Brent Petrie, in his book, Jesus, the Tribulation and the End of Exile, points out that is what the Jews believed. Go back to my video earlier this week where I point out the 14 points that Mr. Petrie gleans from the Jewish rabbinic writings about the last days narrative. Guess what they believed? That before the day of the Lord, there would be the apostasy, there would be the man of sin. You see, Mr. Frost is essentially saying, there are some saying there must be the apostasy, there must be the man of sin before the day of the Lord. And Paul says, I want to correct that. I'm telling you right now, quote, it is possible to see that Paul entirely dismisses such an idea, counters it with his understanding. Well, I want to tell you something. In my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, Fulfilled or Future, I show, number one, what the Jewish eschatological narrative was, documenting from the Jewish writings and from the Old Testament of what the Jews believed would happen in the last days. I document that from Scripture. Point number two, I show that Jesus and all New Testament writers followed that exact narrative, that exact timeline. So Jesus did not counter the Jewish order of occurrence. Jesus did not counter the Jewish timeline of events. His apostles did not change or deny it. And yet, Mr. Frost wants you to believe that Paul was rejecting the entire history of Jewish eschatological timeline that is fully documented in the world's finest scholarship, taken from the rabbinic writings, taken from the Old Testament. Paul was not rejecting the idea that the apostasy had to occur before the day of the Lord. Now watch this. In Matthew chapter 24, remember, as we studied the Olivet Discourse, Jesus said, and I'm just going to go over there very, very quickly because this is really, really critical. Was Paul rejecting the idea of the apostasy before the coming of the Lord? Well, let's see here. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 9 and following, then they will deliver you up to tribulation, will kill you, and you will be hated by nations, all nations for my name's sake. Then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. They're going to fall away. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, apostasy. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of the many, and as the New American Standard Version renders it, the love of the majority of people will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Here is apostasy before the end, before the day of the Lord, before the coming of the Son of Man of Matthew 24. So, here is Jesus who posited the apostasy before the day of the Lord. Mr. Frost wants to try to convince us that the idea of the apostasy before the day of the Lord is a false doctrine. Well, then Mr. Frost is accusing Jesus of false doctrine. Mr. Frost claims here are a classic example of that Latin term that I personally coined. No, it's not a real Latin term, okay. But I coined a Latin term, argumentum ad desperatum. And it means an argument from desperation. Mr. Frost is desperate to sustain his futurism. Now watch this. As we continue, if the man of sin, and yes, there is a plurality that is found in that. But the apostasy most assuredly was in that generation. And it was most assuredly to happen before the day of the Lord. Jesus' own words completely, totally falsify Sam Frost. But watch this. If the man of sin and the apostasy were not to occur prior to the day of the Lord, then why did Paul go ahead to say that the man of sin, he had already talked about him when he was there? Now watch this, verse 6. You know what is restraining. Now wait a minute. If there was no such doctrine as the man of sin or apostasy, then how could Paul say, you know what is restraining? It's either him or it in the Greek. Doesn't matter. But you see, if the man of sin, in whatever form, was not to come before the day of the Lord, then how could the restraining power be already at work? You can't restrain something that is not real. You cannot restrain someone that is not there. You cannot restrain someone, plural, unless they are already there. Now what? You already know what is restraining, that he or it may be revealed in his own time. Well, wait a minute. If the man of sin was not real and would not come before the day of the Lord, then how could he be revealed in the future before the day of the Lord? And then the mystery of lawlessness, what lawlessness? Of the man of sin, is already at work. Oh, wait a minute. Mr. Frost denies that it was supposed to even happen before the day of the Lord. But Paul says, no, it's already at work. Only the one who is now restraining will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then when? when the restrainer is taken out of the way, the lawless one will be revealed. Wait a minute. Mr. Frost denies that there would be a lawless one. But how can the lawless one be revealed? And then watch this. Whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his parousia. Wait a minute. Mr. Frost says the parousia had already happened. Day of the Lord, the parousia had already happened. Oh, but wait. Mr. Frost denies that the lawless one would come before the day of the Lord. But the lawless one would be destroyed at the coming of the Lord. That means the lawless one had to come before the day of the Lord. So, what do we have? We have Mr. Frost virtually denying that all translations which say that the Thessalonians believed the day of the Lord had already come, and Paul is correcting that error, but yet Mr. Frost's own translation supports that idea. Then we have Mr. Frost saying, essentially, there are some denying that the day of the Lord has already come. And Paul says the day of the Lord has already come. Wait a minute. Paul would be denying his own writing if he said, don't let anyone deceive you that the day of the Lord has already come. That's his own translation, agrees with that. So Paul says, don't let anyone deceive you into believing that the day of the Lord has already come. Oh, but wait, the day of the Lord already has come. Was Paul so confused? No, he wasn't. The confusion is not in Paul. You know where it is. And then we have Jesus saying that the apostasy would occur before the day of the Lord, but we have Mr. Frost saying there's a false rumor going around that the apostasy has to take place before the day of the Lord. Paul says that's wrong. No, Jesus said it was right. Then we have Mr. Frost saying there's a false rumor, a false doctrine going around that the man of sin has to arise before the day of the Lord, and yet Paul himself says the man of sin is already being restrained, and the man of sin will be destroyed at the coming of the Lord. That means the man of sin had to exist before the day of the Lord. Look, folks, I'm sorry. You will not find more error packed into just a few pages in any book, almost. This is literally astounding. Now, if you want an in-depth discussion of, number one, the Jewish narrative, then, and the Jewish timeline of the last days, with which Jesus agreed, with which the apostles agreed. They did not disagree with it. Mr. Frost is simply wrong when he says that Paul rejected the idea of a coming apostasy and the coming of the man of sin. He's just simply wrong. I'm sorry. And if you want a development of that, get my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future, or get a copy of my book, How is This Possible? Now, how could anyone say that the day of the Lord had already come? Not possible. So go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Get a copy of either book, okay? I can't pay shipping on this because the book is inexpensive. But remember, for September 2019, my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, is on special. Regularly $23.95 plus $4.95 shipping. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. There's a banner up at the top. Total delivered price for September 2019. It does not apply to overseas order, but contact me for a greatly reduced price for PDF versions, and I'll help you out. Greatly reduced price. DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Look, either book will show to you how absolutely Mr. Frost is guilty of argumentum ad desperatum. His views are simply untenable, and they are false. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I do appreciate it. You have a fantastic weekend. Hope to see you on Monday.